All right, welcome. So tonight we have a story on voter suppression that happened in 1981. And the reason we're bringing up a story about voter suppression that happened almost 40 years ago is that some people are afraid we may see this same tactic come November, right? So we need to be aware of this kind of thing, be informed about what it's about so that we can hopefully combat it so that everyone is able to vote, right? There's a huge movement now on all fronts to suppress the vote, and specifically to suppress the vote of people who would probably be voting Democrat. Okay, so if you look behind me, what you'll see is a poster that goes along with this story. So basically, these voter intimidation tactics took place over a governor race in New Jersey. So what happened was it was a very close race, really had people up in arms about it. There's a lot of emotions flowing. And so what happened was the Republicans said, you know what? We're kind of afraid that there's going to be fraudulent voting. So what we're going to do is we're going to put a force together that's going to go out and it's going to make sure that people are voting in the way that they're supposed to. Really what this was a voter intimidation task force, okay? And they put up these kinds of posters, making it look like they were official, like they were actually part of the government, like maybe they were there on the government's behalf. They weren't. They were part of a Republican plan to intimidate people, both ahead of times, to intimidate people from showing up to the polls, but also intimidating people at the polls, trying to get certain people to turn around and go home. And when I say certain people, can you guess? Can you guess which people were being singled out in lines and intimidated and being asked for ID and all sorts of stuff that these people had no right to ask for? Right? Remember, these were not officials at the polls. These were separate. These were just the Republican Party put together this group and sent them out there to intimidate people. Right? And here we see something making them look like they were maybe official. So let's dig into the story. Okay, so article in The Guardian basically breaks it all down. It's actually a pretty interesting story. So we saw the poster, and then people who were oftentimes off-duty police officers, right? But off-duty, not working in the formal capacity of the government. They were off-duty, doing their own thing, working for the Republican Party. Okay, so what would happen is they'd send these people in, and then these people would say, pick out someone in a line and say, hey, do you have your ID? But these weren't people working at the polls. So you might say, well, yeah, when you show up to vote, you should have your ID, right? So some people think everyone should have their ID when they're voting. These weren't officials at the polling place. This is just someone off the street who dressed up to look official who starts asking you for your ID. Fellow citizens don't just have the right to demand that you show your ID for no reason at all. And sometimes these people were armed. They were wearing official uniforms that made them look like you actually thought these people were some official person, when really all it was an off-duty police officer or whatever who was just trying to intimidate people.
My question to you then is, are you going to have poll watchers? Are you going to have an ability to monitor to avoid fraud and cross-check whether or not these are registered voters, whether or not there's been identification to know that it's a real vote from a real American?
We're going to have everything. We're going to have sheriffs, and we're going to have law enforcement, and we're going to have, hopefully, U.S. attorneys, and we're going to have everybody, and attorney generals.
He's pointing out here that he's going to be sending people into the polls, sheriffs, law enforcement. Now, let's remember, because Trump may not remember that this is how it works, sheriffs and law enforcement are generally state or local employees. They don't work for the federal government. So under what authority would Donald Trump be sending in sheriffs and law enforcement? Well, the most logical thing that we can think of is that the Republican National Party is going to replay what we're talking about here in this video, which is where they come up with a fake group and make them look official, put up posters, put uniforms on them, make them look totally legit, and then send them out to intimidate voters in the voting lines. Okay, and if this sounds like a stretch, let's dig into that. Let's really dig into what happened in 1981 when they did this. So basically, when this happened in 1981, there was a lawsuit. Of course there was, by the Democratic Party, and the Republican Party actually got in trouble for this. All right, the 1981 task force amounted to one of the most egregious examples of election intimidation in America's long history of voter suppression, but had a positive outcome. In the wake of the chilling events, the RNC was sued by the national and state Democratic parties. The case was settled out of court in 1982, at which point the RNC agreed to what was known as a consent decree. So basically, under its terms, the National Republican Party pledged to abstain from poll watching unless it had obtained prior court approval. Party officials who broke that stipulation could be hauled before a federal judge and held in contempt. So this wasn't like, there's a few cases, it seems like it's a little bit of intimidation. No, this was like legit. They got in trouble for intimidation to the point where they gave up their rights for a long time about how they could go about doing this, because they knew they were in trouble. Okay, so here's where things get a little bit interesting. For decades, the RNC was careful to avoid association with any measures that could be construed as intimidatory and to eschew coordination over poll watching with presidential campaigns, including Trump's in 2016. But in 2018, the legal restrictions were lifted after the RNC persuaded a federal judge that it could be trusted not to return to the dark days of New Jersey in 1981, where things got totally out of hand. Except if you're listening to what Trump's saying, it sounds like we're about to do it again. So they've had this lifted for less than 2 years, and they're already going, okay, I guess we're free to do it now. I guess we can get into it, and if we get in trouble, well, we'll deal with it on the other side of the election. But let's remember, if we win, then it'll be fine. It'll be fine. We won't have to face any consequences if we win. It's definitely more concerning when we hear Trump saying he's going to basically do the same thing. He's going to get sheriffs and law enforcement to go out and watch the polls. So the problem is we're hearing the Republican National Party saying that they have 50,000 poll watchers ready to go, right? Off-duty police officers, sheriffs, this kind of stuff. They're recruiting these people to go in and be able to watch the polls, but it's a fine line between all of a sudden becoming intimidation, right? And here's a kicker. The RNC also plans to train hundreds of lawyers ahead of November. They will have access to a $20 million legal fund and will fan out across battleground states in expectation of fierce legal wrangling that could drag on well beyond Election Day, raising spurious fraud allegations or claiming irregularities in mail-in voting. One thing that you know is going to happen for sure after our Election Day, there is going to be lawsuits everywhere. There's going to be all sorts of lawsuits. There's going to be lawsuits about voter suppression related to the post office. There's going to be lawsuits about voter suppression when some of these individuals, these off-duty sheriffs and law enforcement that are being threatened by Trump, get a little too out of hand, right? There's going to be lawsuits over that. But you know what? They don't care, because if it means that they win on election night, then they're good. They're good. They win, right? $20 million legal fund ready to go, ready to just file lawsuits. And they're going to have the paperwork ready, right? They're going to have it ready before the election, just ready to slide it right in there, file that paperwork, and get all this stuff going. It's going to be an absolute mess. It's going to be a disaster. There's going to be so many legal battles going on. A lot of it is that this is going to keep people from even showing up to the polls when they know there's going to be off-duty police there. There's going to be off-duty sheriffs. There's going to be all sorts of off-duty people. People are just going to say, you know what, I can't show up. I can't do that. Plus the virus, of course, which is a whole separate issue that needs to be dealt with for voting. But it's going to keep people from showing up. And then when people are being singled out in line and ask for their IDs, some people are going to turn around and go home without voting, right? It is shameful that in this supposed democracy, we have a history in this country, which is still taking place to this day, of denying people their vote. Absolutely ridiculous. Okay. So we need to be informed about this, right? This is what I'm doing a video on this. We need to understand that this is a different type of tactic, which the Republicans have not been able to access for about 40 years now. But as of 2018, it's open again. They can do this exact thing, right? Because one judge told them that they could. One federal judge says, no, it's okay now. We're changing that consent decree. So expect to see this. We're going to see problems with the post office. We're going to see problems with people being able to vote in person. And now we are going to see these task forces showing up. Trump said it. We watched the video. Trump says he's going to do it. So it's not like, oh, Chris, you're just being paranoid about this. You're reading into things. He told us. He said he's going to send in off-duty sheriffs and law enforcement. That's what they're doing. Okay, thanks for checking out that video. Make sure to hit the subscribe button, and we will see you in the future.